Security officials in Lebanon are clearing protesters from the streets and reopening blocked roads today. The country's prime minister resigned yesterday following 13 days of protest. Demonstrators say the ruling political class is corrupt and inefficient.
Meanwhile, a new article from the Associated Press takes a look at protest movements that have popped up around the world in recent months. In addition to Lebanon, it looks at events in Iraq, Hong Kong, Chile, and the Catalan region of Spain. So Joseph Krauss is the author of that article and joins us now from Beirut to talk about it. So this is a really interesting article. We have been covering these protests, but you know, as it is in news, and there's a lot of domestic stuff to cover. So as it is in news, you get sort of 20, 30 seconds to say protests are flaring up in XYZ. But what was very interesting about your article is you pull it all together and you point out that the last time we sort of saw mass protests, it was during the Arab Spring. But during that time, these were people rising up against authoritarian regimes, dictatorships. This is different. We're talking about people rising up against essentially what are supposed to be democracies.
Yeah, that's true. I think one of the major differences between past waves of protests and the current one is that the current protests that we're seeing not only in the Middle East, but also in Hong Kong, in Catalonia, and Chile, these are directed against, in many cases, elected leaders, and sometimes leaders that were recently elected. And what we're seeing is, and again, we wouldn't want to generalize because all of these protests are rooted in specific local grievances, but there do seem to be a lot of parallels. In a lot of cases, the protests were sparked by relatively minor policies enacted by the government. In Chile, it was a 4-cent hike in subway fares. In Lebanon, where I'm speaking to you from, it was a proposed tax on the WhatsApp messenger service. But as soon as these protests ignited, they became very big. In a lot of cases, they turned violent. And in a lot of cases, you had people demanding much, much wider change, to the point where in Lebanon, people are basically at this point demanding the overthrow of the entire political class that's ruled the country since its 1975 to 1990 civil war.
So, Joseph, take us through some of the responses from the government in these cases where people are protesting. I mean, we've seen the government response. It is mainland China in Hong Kong, and they've used what some people, including the protesters, have called very heavy-handed tactics. What was the response from the government, for example, in Lebanon? We've even seen it here in the United States, over in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you see a spectrum of responses. I think the initial response here in Lebanon, also in Chile, also in other places, was to try to meet some of the protesters' economic demands. So in Lebanon, there were proposals for economic reforms. Those were almost immediately rejected by the protesters. I think it was a similar story in Chile. In Iraq, the parliament voted this week to suspend all bonuses and special privileges for top officials. That also had no impact on the protests. So I think on the one hand, there have been sort of policy responses which have landed with a thud. And then on the other hand, there's been a very heavy crackdown on a lot of these protests. In Iraq, the protests have grown quite violent. The response to them has been extremely violent, with security forces firing tear gas, stun grenades, live fire in a lot of instances. The current death toll from the Iraq protests since the start of the month is over 240 people. And I think the important point here is that neither response really seems to have had much of an impact. Despite all the violence in Iraq, people are still gathering in Baghdad's central Tahrir Square every day. The protests show no sign of ending. And it's a similar story in Lebanon. There was an attack on the main protest camp just yesterday by supporters of the Hezbollah movement. They sort of rampaged through the camp, tore down a bunch of tents, lit some of them on fire. But after a few hours, when the mob had dispersed, the protesters returned to the square. And last night, there was still a very large crowd in a lot of the major squares. So the protests showed no sign of ending, really, in any of these places. And it's not clear what, if anything, these governments can do to stop them or to meet the protesters' demands.
Yeah, because in some of these cases, the governments have actually withdrawn the initial proposal, like they did in Hong Kong eventually. In other cases, like in Lebanon, they just floated an idea of an additional tax, and that was enough to sort of cause this eruption. And, you know, you write that these demonstrations, and you write it at the beginning of the piece there, demonstrations are fueled by local grievances but reflect worldwide frustration at growing inequality, corrupt elites, and broken promises. And you also sort of fold in what you call toxic dysfunction in Washington and London. Essentially, that people are frustrated because the promises that, and I call them democracies. You phrased correctly, they're sort of elected officials, and whether they're democratic is something, to discuss. But the promises that these elected officials have made are not coming to fruition. We're seeing more and more inequality in many of these countries, and people are fed up. But why do they ultimately turn violent?
I think the violence in a lot of cases is a matter of desperation. I think that a lot of these protests initially began peaceful. A lot of them have remained peaceful for the most part. The demonstrations in Lebanon have been almost completely peaceful. There have been a few scuffles and pushing and shoving here and there, but these are mostly peaceful movements. And I think when they become violent, it's a reflection of desperation in a lot of cases. And I think it's also very often in response to the heavy-handed crackdown by security forces. The response from security forces in Iraq has been very violent from the first day. I think there was a similar process underway in Hong Kong where the police were seen as using excessive force in a lot of instances. And I think that sort of escalates the violence on both sides and gets these countries into a cycle where the protesters and the security forces feel like they need to resort to more violent means.
Before we let you go, I just have a quick question, Joseph, about the coverage, because it seems, you pointed out the Arab Spring, Anne-Marie, it seems that the very same notions and ideals that helped to bring about the Arab Spring are evident in some of these protests that are happening around the world, and yet the coverage is different. And I don't know if it's because in the United States we're so embroiled and inward looking as to what's happening in Washington, D.C. with the impeachment inquiry, but it feels as a journalist that there were reporters that were deploying to all of these different countries in the wake of the Arab Spring. There have been reporters, certainly in Hong Kong. We just don't see the same amount of coverage. You remember the Green movement in Iran. I haven't seen reporters, there's certainly print reporters have been there, but it just feels as if the world is not paying as much attention in the Catalan region or what's happening in Iraq or certainly what's going on in Lebanon or in Haiti.
Joseph, do you think it's because the target of the Arab Spring were these authoritarian regimes or these dictatorships, and maybe there's a discomfort now in figuring out how to cover these protests when they're covering what is supposed to be, in some cases, democracies?
Right, people who've been elected.
Right, the democracies that aren't working.
Elections.
Right. Sorry, Joseph, we just rambled on, but what's your take on it?
I think in a lot of these cases, it is a slightly more complex story than the Arab Spring. I mean, the Arab Spring, it was very clear that the protests were against long-serving autocrats. They're rulers who had faces and names, who were very well known, and it was very clear what the protesters wanted and what the resolution to those protests would be, either with the leaders stepping down or being jailed or being chased into exile. And so I think it was maybe an easier story to tell and an easier story to understand. These protests are much more complicated. And I also think it's a function of the fact that we're seeing protests in so many different places right now. It can be hard to keep track of all of them at once. The massive protests in Hong Kong, the protests in Chile, the protests across the Middle East. It can be hard to follow all of these when there's also, of course, major news stories breaking in Washington and in London as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Joseph.
Yeah,
Thank you for putting that into context for us.
Thank you.